I'm going to start by telling you that the older I become, the more convinced I am that sea life is not the place for a normal woman. Even if it does offer her a living. We are constantly at the passenger's beck and call, from early in the morning until quite late at night. Do you know how long my normal workday is? 17 hours. Fortunately, with tips, the earnings are good for a woman. I have been able to support my mother since I went to sea 8 years ago. Oh, forgive me. I have not even introduced myself. My name is Violet Jessup, although most of the passengers that I serve simply call me Miss or you. Now that the Great War is over, I'm back at work here as a stewardess on the Olympic. But that's not what you wanted to hear about, is it? Most people I meet will ask me straight off, is it true you were on both the Titanic and her identical sister ship Britannic, and you survived the sinkings of them both? Yes, it's true. No one really ever asks me about the Olympic, but then she hasn't sunk. Oh, I tell you, there is nothing like a cup of tea after a long day on your feet. The passengers on this ship just about wear me out. They're all at luncheon now, so I have a few blissful moments to relax with all of you. I have made 24 trips thus far on the Olympic, round trip from Southampton in England to New York and back. All 3 ships were supposed to make that trip. The idea was that on any given week, one of the ships would leave from England, one would leave from New York, while the third one was being cleaned and coaled. Great business strategy for the White Star Line. For the first time ever, really. Regularly scheduled weekly departures. Sadly, it required having 3 ships, and only the Olympic ever made it into regular full-time service. Isn't this lovely? White Star Line steamships are known for their incomparable luxury, but there's very little glamorous about the life of a stewardess. White Star Line sent me to an old, established firm to get this. I think the business was as archaic as this fashion. It's supposed to resemble a nurse's uniform, but it always makes me feel like nothing so much as a prison wardress. I joined the White Star Line in 1910, and 1 year later, they chose me among their hand-picked crew for their magnificent new ship, Olympic. First of these 3 sister ships launched, and at the time, the largest and finest steamship ever built. We had never seen such a magnificent ship. In her first class alone, she had a dining saloon with reception room, reading and writing room, lounge, smoking room for gentlemen only, a la carte restaurant, and palm court. To say nothing of the gymnasium, the squash racket courts, Turkish baths, and swimming pool on the ship. Not 1, but 3 elevators for first class alone and another elevator for second class. More than equal to the finest hotel on land. And such a kind ship. You know, all ships have a personality. She was as friendly as she was grand. The passengers, however, lived up to their reputation. They expected the very best, and they got it, even if it left us exhausted in the process. I have trudged all over ships, to and fro, with sore feet and worn-out nerves, just to meet the demands of some noted passenger who thought nothing of demanding exactly what she wanted. Oh, my dear, I don't want to bother coming in off the deck just now. It is so much cooler out here than it is in there. So I know you won't mind giving dear little teeny weeny her Pekingese, her lamb cutlet and green peas, and make sure they're fresh peas and well mashed up. She would wave her heavily jeweled hand and say, I just know you'll do this for me. You're all so good to me. You spoil me so, and I always get what I want. I am a friend of the president of the line. Do you know, in the few short years I have been with White Star Line, I have met, literally, hundreds of friends of the president of the line. Poor Mr. Ismay, blessed with this overabundance of friendships. But I do like Americans. It's refreshing. Americans will treat you as a person first, not a servant. That makes a world of difference. And New York, such a wonderful, lovely city. I had trouble overcoming the feeling that those skyscrapers shooting straight up into the sky were not about to topple down right on top of me. And the winds would come roaring around the corners of the buildings, as if their singular goal were to relieve one of all one's clothing. I had never seen so many limbs publicly exposed. I love New York shops, though. And the shop girls, if they wanted to put their gum somewhere while talking to you, they just did it under the table. And if they thought you had used the wrong word, well, they would happily correct you. Oh, you mean you need a new brassiere? Because they really wanted you to have exactly what you wanted. And I usually fell right into their trap, walking out of there with 3 pairs of stockings for $3 when I had gone in to buy 1 pair for $1.10. My first year on Olympic was over before I even knew it. We had only just learned our way around and gotten our feet used to those long alleyways when White Star Line transferred many of us to the Titanic. Now, she was the Olympic sister ship, so nearly identical, just a few modifications to make her a little heavier. And there you are, the new, largest and finest steamship ever built. And it was true. Olympic was beautiful, but oh, Titanic, decidedly grander, far more luxurious. She had private promenades in her millionaire suites, a Parisian cafe for afternoon tea, and a wrought iron and glass skylight over the grand staircase. The grand staircase started on A deck and descended down through 4 decks to the first-class dining saloon on D deck. I used to feel a little thrill when I went down the Titanic's first-class alleyways. You would pass the room decorated in the Regency style, and then the next one done in the Dutch style, and then the Georgian style, all of them with luxurious silk furnishings and hand-carved wood. Each stateroom in first class had both cold and hot running water. I will always say that never before or since has there been such a perfect ship. Elizabeth, come and look. First class passenger list. All the best families, just as you expected. Americans are so eager to be out there. Oh, Colonel and Mrs. John Jacob Astor. You must have heard he divorced his first wife to marry her. There was a great scandal. They had to escape almost immediately to Europe to get away from the talk. I imagine she must be beautiful. A woman who could overcome that sort of opposition and marry the man she loves. Oh, and Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. He owns Macy's, the department store. Such a lovely couple. I always say they are old in years, but very much young at heart. And, oh, yes, Miss Marcia Spatz, the most overbearing woman I've ever had. She'll undoubtedly arrive all packages and hat boxes and flowers, never-ending boxes of flowers, presumably thank offerings for her departure. We always wondered on sailing day, how would the passengers measure up? People are usually quite different from how you picture them. However, the Strausses were, as usual, pleased to see us and delighted with all the arrangements we had made. And another older woman arrived, a Miss Townsend. We knew her because she had been blacklisted by another famous shipping line. She was absolutely unreasonable in her demands. Yes, miss. Mirrors everywhere in your cabin. Yes, we can do that. And all the furniture? You want all the furniture in your cabin changed? Yes, of course. The two stewards who undertook that job took the precaution of stepping down to the pantry for a few quick doubles to bolster their spirits. And Mr. Andrews came on board, too. Thomas Andrews, the designer of these beautiful ships and one of the finest, kindliest of men. He was the only one who actually listened to the crew's request for our own quarters. I think the Olympic was the first ship I was ever on that actually had proper bathrooms for the stewards. My roommate, Elizabeth Leather, and I actually had room to dress without risking serious injury to life and limb. I used to stop Mr. Andrews in the alleyways. He always gave me a friendly word. The only regret that I ever heard him utter was that we were getting further from home. He loved his Irish home. I often thought later about how much he had longed to return to Ireland for some much-needed rest. Well, we were below decks when the Titanic took off on a soft afternoon, April 10th, 1912. But we could hear the send-off, goodbyes, fluttering handkerchiefs. We could hear the din in the ship's whistle and smell the coal odor in the air. Few crew members ever have a chance to really see a ship's departure. I've often wanted to see the ship I was on from a distance. And that day, I very much wanted to see her. But soon as the passengers were on board, we started getting calls. I'd be very pleased to bring you some vases for your flowers, Mum. 8 or 10? Yes, of course. Oh, yes. Some of them will be very tall indeed. 8 or 10 vases is the usual allotment for a stewardess's entire section. And no vase is ever more than 8 or 10 inches tall. But Americans, you see, consider it a sin if you cut the stems of their precious American beauty roses. I'm convinced they grow those flowers exclusively for the lengths of their stems. When the Titanic stopped briefly in Cherbourg in France that night, Colonel and Mrs. Astor came on board. What a surprise she was! Instead of this radiant young woman I had imagined, she was a pale, drab-looking girl, seemed utterly bored. Clearly, all the wealth in the world does not make for inner happiness. And at the end of that first day at sea, when I just ached all over, with just enough energy left to crawl back to my own bunk, I saw Miss Spats come sailing towards me. "My dear, you look so tired. Are you going off duty now?" "That is my earnest hope." "Well, before you go, you might just as well pop down to the pantry and make me a few sandwiches. And get me some cracked ice and some hothouse grapes and anything else that looks good to you. Just look around, Oh. Normally, getting acquainted with a new ship is not easy, but in this case, it was mostly peace, good fellowship. The sky was clear, the sea was mostly calm. Titanic seemed contented, even restful. I even had a chance to pay a few social calls. I liked to drop in on the ship's good Irish doctor, Dr. O'Loughlin. His door was usually open. I would say to him, "Dr. O'Loughlin, how has anyone so kind and so charming as you ever remained a bachelor?" "Well, sure," he'd say, "and haven't I worn out the knees of me pants, what with proposing to ladies? And sure, they won't have anything to do with me at all." He was our darling deceiver. And perhaps the sky was not quite as blue on our fourth day out. Perhaps there was a nip in the air as evening set in. It only seemed to make our warm ship seem cozier. I remember the music that Sunday night was at its most cheerful. When I ran into Jock Hume, the first violinist, he told me in his rich Scottish accent he was going to give them a real tune, a Scotch tune to finish up with. He was so full of life. Remember, too, that I went up on deck before retiring just to get a bit of fresh air. It was quite late, after 11, and the sea was perfectly serene for miles, just calm all around us. No moon, just stars, and this biting chill that drove me indoors for bed and a good book. I could see the men way up in the crow's nest. I was very glad not to have their job that night. Ooh. Hello, Elizabeth. You look snug. I'm going to read for a bit. Is that all right? Oh, I forgot about this. It's a prayer that an old Irish woman gave me when we stopped there. Something about protection against fire and water. It's strangely worded, but it's quite beautiful. I was almost asleep when I heard it. This low, crunching, ripping sort of a sound. Titanic shivered just a bit, and then her engines softly stopped. Quiet for a moment, and then I could hear doors opening and voices talking softly. I lay absolutely still. I couldn't admit, even to myself, what I feared. It sounds as if something has happened. Faithful old Stanley, one of our bedroom stewards, came, knocked at the door. "I'm calling all our people, sister." He always called me sister. "Anything you'd like me to do for you? You know the ship is in trouble?" No, thank you, Stan." Elizabeth and I got dressed. We said very little. Well, it can't be serious trouble. That's nonsense. She's entirely new. But we could feel that the engines had stopped. After 4 days of that constant movement, everything was suddenly, utterly still. I went through my section, tying on life jackets, trying to reassure. Must wake up now, head upstairs. Put on your warmest clothing. Do take a blanket. Everyone was quite calm. They were probably thinking, as I was, that this was all too unbelievable. Everyone is to go up to the boat deck. Just a precautionary measure. Yes, just a precaution. Up you go. They were slow to go up. Some of them were joking. To the few who showed any concern, I could hear officers saying to them, plenty of other ships in the vicinity. Some of them will be with us shortly. I went back to my own bunk, not quite sure what to do. I remember I started tidying up. I was folding my nightdress when Stanley reappeared. "My God," he said, "don't you realize that this ship has struck an iceberg, that she is sinking? You have to get to the boat deck as quickly as possible." All right, I need to get a hat. Do you know I forgot to bring a warm hat with me? It was spring when we left Southampton. Who was even thinking about hats to wear for icebergs? No, I can't wear that one, Stanley, all fussy and cheery. I'll take this one. Thank you, Stan. You'll be coming up yourself in a minute, won't you? The last I saw of him, Stan was standing with his hands behind his back, where he usually kept his evening watch. He looked suddenly very tired. Dear, ugly, big-hearted Stan. Elizabeth and I went up onto the boat deck. Passengers were just wandering around, not quite sure what to do. The captain, Captain Smith, looked disturbed. Passengers would never have noticed it, but I did. "Well, Jock, are you going to play your violin out here?" "Ah, I see what you mean. Yes, a bit of a tune would cheer things up." Soon we could hear the band playing from where we stood on the deck watching. They were playing ragtime. No one seemed anxious to move. The Titanic seemed so steady. Someone pointed at a tiny dot way out on the horizon. It was probably another ship. That reassured people. They would bide their time. The first lifeboats were lowered at about 12:45 with very few people in them. "Mr. Andrews, is it really serious?" "Oh, I know, but I didn't want to put a life jacket on." "Well, to be honest, I was afraid it might scare people." He told me to put it on if I valued my life and to walk about, let others see me. I turned to say something to Elizabeth, and I noticed for the first time that the forward part of the ship was lower now, much lower. For a fraction of a second, my heart stood still. Then we heard a shot. Distress rockets. Soon they were going off every few minutes. Lifeboats began to be lowered much more quickly. Now people were realizing the danger. We could see women clinging to their husbands before being put into the lifeboats with their children. A mail sorter joined me and remarked very casually, "The mail is floating up to E deck now with the water." We watched as a man ran to the ship's side and flung himself into a descending boat. Everyone murmured in disapproval. At about 1:15, Officer Moody asked if Elizabeth and I would please get into a lifeboat to show some of the third-class women that it was perfectly safe. He looked very tired, but he gave us this friendly smile. We got in. "Yes, Officer Moody, what is it?" No, I don't think I should. It was somebody's forgotten baby." "All right, yes, I'll look after it." Poor thing. As barely enough room here for us to sit. Excuse me, do you know no English? All right. The ropes groaned as we went down, a long way down. Our lifeboat was towards the rear, boat number 16. It was 7 decks down to the ocean floor far below us. Everything was black. There was just this occasional glaring light from each row of portholes we passed on the way down. Oh, this is a dream. It has to be. It can't be real. There were people standing by the railing watching us descend, absolutely unconcerned. They must think this is all a bad dream, too. We hit the water with a huge impact. Hadn't we better row away from the ship? You must be a fireman. I can tell by the coal dust. No, thank you. I don't smoke. You have it. You look like you need a cigarette more than I do, with just that one thin shirt on. As we slowly pulled away, I wondered if I just stared at her hard enough, if I could keep the ship afloat. It's funny, 4 days earlier, I had wanted to see her from a distance, and now here she was, our beautiful Titanic, queen of the ocean, all lit up like a jewel. I started to count the rows of deck lights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then again. 1, 2, 3, 4. I must have miscounted. 1, 2, 3, 4. No, I was right the first time. Only 4 rows of deck lights visible now. The women around me in the boat were weeping, some just quietly and some without abandon. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. I was praying for all of them, but I tried not to think of any one in particular. Where was that other ship? I mean, surely she should have been here by now, but no. Actually, she seemed farther away. Strange. 1, 2, 3. There hadn't been any wind at all that night. When a breeze blew against my cheek, it felt like a knife in that cold air. We were paralyzed with cold. The musicians had stopped playing ragtime. They had switched to hymns. And then, as the stern of the Titanic rose higher and higher into the air, the forward funnel suddenly broke off. It looked like it was a cardboard model, just broken off into the sea. There were a few awful screams, then silence. 1 more row of deck hole lights disappeared. And then we heard this terrible, thundering crash as everything inside Titanic broke loose. Tables, chairs, fine china, heavy machinery. We heard this awful booming, crunching, exploding noise. The lights, which had been on this entire time, flickered off, came back on briefly, and then went out forever. The whole stern of Titanic stood straight up on end, and then, slowly at first and gradually picking up speed, the whole ship just slid down and disappeared under the waves. One awful moment of empty blackness, and then this unforgettable, agonizing scream. 1,500 people screaming out there. This long, heart-wrenching cry that went on for 15, 30 minutes and then died out. Just our little boat tossing around in that huge, icy black water. We sat in that lifeboat all night, maybe 8 hours, with no light, no food, no water. As the first rays of dawn lit the horizon, we could see these huge icebergs all around us, like monsters of destruction. There was nothing else we could see, no other lifeboats in view, just ice and water everywhere. The sky was a rosy pink when someone finally pointed a trembling finger at a dot out on the horizon. It was a ship, and getting closer. The women around me in the boat began weeping again. One poor soul, who had had her head buried in her hands all night, thought we were going back to Titanic and that she'd soon be reunited with her husband and her 2 sons. We were one of the last of the lifeboats to reach that rescue ship, Carpathia. After I climbed up the rope ladder, somebody poured a glass of brandy down my throat. It felt like molten fire. I was still holding that baby against my hard cork life jacket when suddenly a woman leaped at me, grabbed the baby, and ran off with it. I found out later she had put her baby down on the deck of the Titanic while she went to fetch something, and when she came back, her baby was gone. I was too numb and frozen at the time to think it strange that she had not even bothered to thank me. It took us 4 days to reach New York on the Carpathia. Such an agonizing trip, so many widows, and so many of our own dear friends gone. Thomas Andrews, Dr. O'Loughlin, Jock, Stan, all missing. Mrs. Strauss had refused to be separated from her husband, and they were both gone. Of the 2,200 people who had been on board Titanic, only 705 of us made it to the Carpathia. And I went back to work almost immediately. If I hadn't, I never would have had the nerve to sail again. They added lifeboats, of course, before everyone had said it was totally impractical for a ship to carry lifeboats for everyone on board. Now, they easily found a way to do it. When the Great War broke out, I left the White Star Line. I joined the British Red Cross. But when I became overtired with changing bandages and I accidentally poisoned my hand with a needle, a doctor recommended that I go back to sea, back to the air I was used to. And White Star Line very agreeably gave me the first nurse's aide vacancy on their magnificent new ship, Britannic. Third sister to Olympic and Titanic. She had not even entered the passenger service when the war broke out, and the government immediately requisitioned her as a hospital ship. Beautiful accommodations for wounded soldiers coming home from the Mediterranean front. I was hoping that we might go to Malta, which is where my brother William was recovering from a war sickness, but no. She was far too large for Malta's harbor. We would be going to Mudros instead. I even have still the letter that I wrote to my brother Patrick describing the disaster. November 21st, 1916, my dear Patrick, I expect you'll be glad to hear from your big sister and to know I am still in the land of the living. You probably have heard all about the disaster by now, but let me describe my experiences. It was sunny Tuesday morning. When the explosion came, I was in the pantry. I was making breakfast for a fellow nurse who was sick. We were all in good spirits. There was going to be hard but satisfying work ahead of us. Wounded soldiers were due to embark that very afternoon. Suddenly, there was this dull, deafening roar, and the whole Britannic shook from stem to stern. Everything inside that pantry shook violently. There was no question we must have hit something, but only much later did I learn it had been a German-laid mine. What a difference from Titanic. There, everything had been unhurried calmness. This time, there was no hesitation. Everyone instantly dropped what they were doing and vanished. I was standing there with a teapot in one hand and a pat of butter in the other, and the room was suddenly empty. I hurried to the nurse in sickbay, got her dressed, sent her up with the others. The alleyways were already deserted as I made my way back to my own bunk. I could already feel the sloping. But I quickly gathered up a few things to take with me. I took my prayer book, of course, and my toothbrush. I had complained to Patrick about being unable to get a toothbrush after Titanic. Well, Vi, he said, never undertake another disaster without first making sure of your toothbrush. I put my life jacket on over my coat, totally disregarding my own advice to others. Always put your coat on last, so it could easily be discarded in case one needed to swim. Well, I hardly expected to need to swim. This time I was sure there would be plenty of lifeboats for everyone. The mine had exploded somewhere underneath the grand staircase, and as I made my way up to the boat deck, I could smell the smoke drifting up from below. But the boat deck was warm and full of sunshine, and that reassured me. Then I saw an officer looking at me in surprise. Where are all the other women? All of them? All in the first two boats and all gone? I could see them slowly pulling away from the ship. The officer told me that since all the women had already left, I would have to go in the boat assigned to me, which was boat number 7. Just at that moment, a lifeboat caught my eye. It had reached the water safely, but suddenly was pulled backwards towards the Britannic's propellers, which were starting to emerge from the water. The captain was still steaming forward. He was hoping to reach shallow water and save the ship, but it meant that as the propellers began to emerge from the water, several lifeboats were getting sucked back right into them. I took a deep breath, and I got in. It was awful. There was wreckage and red streaks in the water. The lifeboat falls had men clinging to them. They looked like flies on flypaper. We went down very quickly, scraping against the ship's sides. At one point, glass splintered in our faces. It was from the light box, which would be lit up at night to make a green lighted band all around the ship so everyone would know she was a hospital ship and not attack. As soon as we hit the water, every man in the lifeboats around us began to leap into the sea. I could hear thuds all around, but no shouts, not a word, just dozens of men running away, like it was a battle and we were all running away from the enemy. In a few minutes, I was the only one left in that lifeboat, except one other man, a doctor. And then I saw why. We were getting pulled back towards those propellers, which were still churning with this sort of merciless rhythm. I looked back, and the doctor was gone. In another minute, I would be pulled under those blades. I looked at the sea. I have always been afraid of water, and I have never learned to swim. But I had no choice. I had to go. So I did. I took a deep breath and I just jumped, falling away into that bottomless sea. It was the first time in my life I had ever been under the water. As I came up, the back of my head hit violently against the keel of a lifeboat, and then again another terrific crash on my head. My brain shook like it was inside a bottle. Panic seized me, and I started to grope around blindly. And just as I thought, this was it, this was the end, I rose up to the surface, miraculously flung away from the ship. It was a horrible scene of slaughter. Wreckage was everywhere. I grabbed a life jacket that came floating past, and I clung to it, watching as the Britannic took her death plunge. Just like Titanic. At the very end, the whole stern stood straight up on edge, and then she just slid down, thundering with unimaginable violence. Miraculously, only 30 people died that day. 1,100 were saved. The water was warm and full of fishing boats. One of them pulled me in, and we made our way to the tiny island of Kea. What a glorious relief to finally reach a hotel and a very welcome cup of tea. Your loving sister, Violet. After that disaster, I was very glad that I had my toothbrush. My teeth were covered in oil and cork dust. The matron saw me scrubbing it off. "Wherever did you get that toothbrush?" Apparently, she thought it superfluous to ask if I were hurt or to express any relief that I had survived. Well, I brought it with me. She looked so astonished and so suspicious. I think she thought I was in league with the enemy and had packed a weekend bag to bring with me in the lifeboat. She never thought to ask if I was hurt. My leg was gashed to the bone. Took 3 years to heal. And years later, when a dentist x-rayed my head to discover the cause of my terrible headaches, it was discovered that I had once badly fractured my skull. You might very well ask, therefore, after everything I have seen, whatever would induce me to return to the sea? Surely not the pay, which really is pitiful, or the servitude always expected of an ocean steward. Well, there is the employment. I have no training or education to do anything else. But I suppose, despite everything I have seen, there still remains this certain hope, an enticement that I cannot resist. So many places I long to see. Japan, Java, Siam. I think about the sight of a beautiful dawn breaking on the horizon of the Atlantic Ocean, or the soft air and that green, earthy smell of an island as we steam up. Do you know I can tell the difference between the smell of land and the smell of the sea? Even if I am in a deep sleep, that land smell will wake me up. I suppose for me, as for any sailor, it is that hope, a new ocean, a new horizon. And as you all know, there really is no other way to cross an ocean except by ship. So here I am. Oh, forgive me. I didn't mean to jabber on this long. My passengers will be returning soon, and I should be ready when the bells come. Such a pleasure talking with all of you today. I would like to wish all of you very pleasant and very safe journeys home. Thank you, and good day. So, thank you.